Good morning and Afreilich Purim. May this Purim demonstrate what happened almost 2,400 years ago, that v'napachu, that all the enemies of Israel and of good people were obliterated and was transformed to la Yehudim ha'isa eire v'simcha v'sasan v'yikot. That was in Persia of old. That was in Persia of old, and right back exactly in the same location, literally, where Shushan and other cities in Persia taking place with exactly similar characters, wanting the same, God forbid, genocide of the Jews. It's exactly the words that the late Ayatollah Khamenei has been pointed out, same word, same name as Haman, with a K at the beginning, wanted to obliterate the Jews just as Haman did. And we know the end there, and the end today will be even better than that. So, in that honor, and God protecting our holy soldiers in the Tzahal, I just spoke to someone who has a son, a major, and the mood obviously is extremely upbeat, especially Purim Dik, but still, God should protect them all and protect Jews everywhere, protect good people everywhere. And may this come to an end, and a new era begins in the Middle East of peace and prosperity and Mashiach. Okay.
Amen.
And our learning is in that schus, Purim, even though Purim is a day of total simcha, but we also know Purim is also kimu v'kibla Yehudim. The Gemara says that at Purim they ratified that which began at Matan Torah, and because they accepted it willingly, Purim, with Mesiras Nefesh. So Purim is also a day where we, in a sense, consummate the commitment and our receiving of the Torah. And here we are learning in Primis Torah, Hemshech Samach Vav. We continue our journey, and we are on we're up to page 54, top of page 54. We concluded page 53, and I'll review it, and we shall learn it with a Purim Dika spirit, and it'll open up. Psiches ha-chushim is an expression opening up the channels of our minds, of our conscious minds and our super conscious minds. Purim is a day of super consciousness, adalo yada, even beyond yada, to the point that we can transform even the darkest of dark. The curse, Arur Haman, can be transformed into a Baruch Mordechai, into a blessing, when you reach those highest levels. And talking about levels, that's what we're discussing here in Samach Vav, which is based on, this section is all based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, as cited in footnote 60, but also in the beginning of this Maimer printed by Mori Admur HaZaken, in Yonim, volume 1, page 113 and on. It's in footnote 1 is the details. And what we're learning is Bir Inyan, to explain the connection we have to Primis Haratzon through mitzvahs. He says, Bir Inyan on page 52, just to keep the flow of ideas, not forget about the bigger plot. Yesh lahagdim, why all the Giluyim Elyenim are called Ur. Ur, or sometimes uses the word Ur and Ziv, but Ur, light, reflection, Gilui. And he's been explaining that's what we're in the middle of discussing. And the essential point is because Ur has in it a dual properties. On one hand, it's Shalei Berech. It's well, let's start the other way. On one hand, it's a reflection of the source. So it is communicating and expressing the source, which of course is critical because the source is God, and that's what you want to follow. On the other hand, it's only a reflection. It's not a piece of it, meaning it's not a muhus to muhus, which helps us understand how there's the ability for it to transition into levels that are not atzmus, that are not the moyer, the source. So it has both elements to it. On one hand, it is coming from the source, and it's rooted there, but it's not of the muhus of the source. It's like a muhus acher is the words he used, or here muhus nifrad, separate, different, as he's been explaining. And the example that Alter Rebbe gave for this was Esis HaMachshava. That was paragraph 2, page 52 and 53. Letters of thought that originate in the soul, but then they start manifesting in actual letters, tangible ones. So again, you have both elements to it. And in the last paragraph that we learned on page 53, he went back why it's described when something, the evolution and the process, through Seder Shtalshus, the process of one level going to the next level, kinu, kol yisavas tacht melium b'chinas er v'ziv. But now he adds more explanation based on what we've learned, that it's er v'ziv levad, so its root, it comes from the atzmas elyon in its root, avlum hu sacher, kishen ispashet. And that's vital, even though he doesn't say it explicitly, because we want to have an existence like ourselves. If it remains the same mahus as atzmus, then we'll never have an independent consciousness, an independent existence like ourselves. So what Ur does, it helps us understand how Elokus can be transmitted while at the same time allowing for another personality to emerge, so to speak. Now remember, Ur is not another personality. He made it clear. It's not Nifrad, Pirut Chaz V'Shalom, because it's still connected and attached, like you said, the light is connected to the source. But it's Kemahus Achar, and he explained it by understanding how Ur is manifest within Kalim. That there's 3 levels to Ur. There's the Ur as it's encompassed in the source. So there, of course, it's very much like the source. Then there's Ur as it descends. He calls the Irida from Atzmusei, and basically being prepared lislabish b'kelim, to manifest in Kalim. The first level he called Antu Chad, v'lei b'chushban. The second level is Esespheres bli mahus, doesn't have a mahus yet. And then comes the third level as the Eris actually manifest in the containers, to use the exact words, Mislabish er ba'kelim, and that's when it becomes mahus chachma, mahus chesed. And the example of the colors of light are the containers, are the colors. And the colors project into the light, meaning the light assumes the colors that the kalim create. So he says, Yesh Leimer, that the second level, before it's entering into kalim, but it's already so-called outside of Atzmus, is like a lavush. It's not a mahusacher because it's still part of the body like we learned before, but it's be'ena reichel etzem. You can't compare a garment, even an attached garment, to the etzem, because it's only a reflection, ha'ara. Okay? And b'chinas gvane ha'er, the colors he calls, that's already the air that, as they are in the kalim, the nasim ba'er kalim, that the kalim cause these colors. And that is called mahus acher, nifred min ha'etzem. So that's even a lower level, but it's still Ur. Afal Pikein Hoyel Achodim Mamish is still attached, still called Ur. It hasn't lost those properties. And the best proof is because if you remove the source, the light will also disappear. Mashenkin Ishtalshus Mahus L'Mahus, a different form of relationship of levels would be when one mahus transfers over to another mahus. That's not the case here. Here, it's not mahus le-mahus, because here it's a reflection. It's still Ur, it's light. And then he's concluded that this is the manner that all the partsufim, all the structures in the shtalshus evolve from one another. Al derech Moshli gives the midas. So even though they're like a moyer, like he said before, a higher level is like a luminary compared to a lower level, compared to Koyach HaMachshava, nevertheless, it's only a reflection. It's only a reflection. And what's that reflection coming from? From the koyach habina. Because the midas, so even though the midas compared to the machshava are like a source, a ma'ir, but compared to their source, which is bina, they're only a reflection, ema bonim. And the same thing, l'mayla parts of zoh b'chinas ha'ara levad mahabina. And same thing, chachma bina from keser, and keser compared to atzmos eid and sof, like the ratzon itself, that even though it's such a high level compared to lower levels, but it itself is only a reflection from mahus v'atzmos hanefesh. What I was wondering before we continue, why does he bring mashenkein b'chinas istalshus mahus lemahus? Because here he clearly saying that the istalshus, that we are, the istalshus of the entire existence is all like a reflection. It's not mahus lemahus. Is he suggesting that there is in our istalshus something that is mahus lemahus, like yesh liyesh? That's most likely what he's suggesting. He's not saying what those levels are, because it's definitely not the levels of Ratzon, Chachma Bina, Bina to Midas, Midas to Machshava, because that he calls Ha'ara.
What about Olam LaOlam?
So that's the question. Is he alluding to something like that? He doesn't say what he's alluding to, or he's just using it for contrast purposes to point out, because the language of the Alter Rebbe is Kol hagiluyim elyenim nikra b'shem eir. Kol giluyim elim seems to suggest all giluyim, and then he said the word kol kinu kol isav is tachta me'elyin, which would also suggest bria from Atzilus is also tachta me'elyin, or perhaps that's not the case. I'm pointing it out simply just to make the point. I can't say I have anything conclusive. My understanding from other places in Chassidus would be that in the Ishtalshus itself, you have things that are yesh, like a oir and a moir, like oir, and there are things that are not like oir, like a yesh, like when you say yesh anivra, or yes, bria from Atzilus, for example, is a nivra. Atzilus is not a nivra. So perhaps that's what he means. But you could also go, if you go a little deeper, you could say that everything has both elements to it. Because if you remember Ayin Beis in the beginning, and we're going to learn it also here, Samach Vav later, he asked the question whether Atzilus is Yesh Ma'ayin or Gilead Helam. So if it's Gilead Helam, then it's the more like Ur. But if it's Yesh Ma'ayin, that means you're talking about an infinite leap from the Ayin to the Yesh. So it could be, that's not what he's addressing here, because here he's addressing the Ur element that everything in the Shtalshlus has. But if you're talking about the Ein HaReich of everything to Atzmus, you could say everything is a Yesh. Like for example, even Ur itself, he doesn't say this right here, but we're going to learn it later, I believe. Even Ur itself, talking about Ur and Sof compared to Atzmus, you can also call it technically Yesh Ma'ayin. It doesn't behave like a Yesh because it's a reflection of its source, and a Yesh is not. But from the point of view of its distance, it's infinitely distant from Atzmus just much as a Yesh is infinitely distant, because God is not closer to Ur, as we've learned many times, that God can be called a Moir. He can behave like a Moir. He also has the ability to give off light. But that's not his identity. So the Shemesh, a sun and sunlight, you cannot call them infinitely distant. Because the sun was created. The sun was created in order to give off light. The Pasuk says, L'hoyer ala oretz. The whole sun was created to be a luminary. You can't chaz v'shalom say that on God, that God is there in order to give off light. He has the ability to give off light, but when he gives off light, there's an infinite distance. Now, so it's very likely you could say that everything in the Shtalshlus has also an element of that type of distance. But then you wouldn't call it mahus le-mahus either. Because then the Ur is not, then if you're talking about the infinite distance, you wouldn't call it that it's a piece of a higher level. Because it's not, it's actually infinitely distant from it. So, just pointing out some points that maybe would come up when you think about this. Practically speaking, regarding what we're discussing here clearly the emphasis is on the Ur. He's not talking about the Mahus L'Mahus, he's contrasting it to that. So, without going into more details, because you could obviously dissect this further, I just wanted to say it because it jumps out at you when you start thinking about what are we talking about here. Now, interesting point to make as well, that he says in the Geras HaKodesh, when the Yesh HaNivra, he says, comes from the Yesh HaMiti, because the fact that we don't feel we have a source comes from the atzmus that has no source. So there, you could say it's maybe muhus muhus. The muhus of atzmus has been, so to speak, God has transferred it, or at least imparted part of that within us. But there, I would stay away from the word muhus muhus, because at the end of the day, we are a creation. We're talking about the yesh now. We're not talking about chelik elikam mal mamish. We're talking about a yesh, and the yesh, you cannot call it a muhus of atzmus. You could say it has the properties of mitzuse matzmuse that atzmus gave over, just like we have the property of free will that God imparted to us. But you cannot call it muhus l'muhus, just for the record. As far as chelik elikam mal mamish goes, can you call that muhus l'muhus? Because chelik elikah seems to suggest it's a piece of godliness. However you explain the word chelik, but point is, it's not just a reflection. It's a chelik elikah. And a chelik is shetefes ba'etzem, shetefes bechelke, shetefes bekulei, we're told. So that I'd rather not go into right now because it's a little more complicated. We're going to learn about that later as well, because the neshama is a very different category than what we're saying. Here we're talking about hishtalshlus oir. When he says here, he's not talking about a neshama. Neshama has a particular, you call it bonim atem la'Hashem alekechem vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. So you don't use the regular language of oir. Oir, God uses to create everything. Everything goes through God's oir, the kav. Literally everything, all of existence. A neshama has its own particular root. And that's why I want to stay away from that in this context. I think we already discussed it a bit in a previous class, but just in the context that I'm describing right now. But bottom line is that here clearly the emphasis is that it's all like oir, ha'ara, and as you just explained. Good. So that finishes page 53. So now I'm ready to continue unless somebody wants to ask something. Good. So we're now on page 54. And I should emphasize again, this is either the language or at least close to the language of the Alter Rebbe. So you'll find, I find at least, being quite familiar with the Rebbe Rashab's signon, the Rebbe Rashab style of writing, that clearly is not original Rebbe Rashab style. Because the Rebbe Rashab generally speaks a little more bislapshus, like words like, for example, he says before, that Elyon was bechinas moyer legaba hatachten. As soon as you see that, if you're familiar with the language of the Rebbe, you realize it's a language from a previous mimer, and in this case, the Alter Rebbe. And the same thing here, a few different pieces that are that way. I'm just pointing that out. But that doesn't make it less or more. I'm just saying that it's clear the Rebbe Rashab is citing that mimer from the Alter Rebbe, and he's explaining it. So he continues here with the language of the Alter Rebbe. Top of page 54. The pages can be found if you want to follow the text at samachvav.com. V'hine, and now, b'chlolis inyan eres v'kelim, anisker be'etz chaim. The general idea of eres and kelim that are described, mentioned in Eitz Chaim. Now, eres and kelim is not the only place that it's mentioned, obviously, in Kabbalah, but Eitz Chaim is a magnum opus, is a very fundamental source text of the Arizal, Eitz Chaim. She says the inyan of eres and kelim that's mentioned in Eitz Chaim, and we've already referred to eres and kelim. We just talked about the colors and how the kelim affect the eir in the third level. He says like this: B'chol madrega madrega yesh b'zeh gimel madregas. In every level of the eres and kelim, there are three levels. What he means by every level is that wherever you go, there are three levels in this process. Now, these are the three levels that he mentioned in the previous parentheses. We'll soon see. Not sure yet, because I'm reading it together. We're reading. Let's see. There are three levels. Ukamoshel, and now he's going back to the example of machshava. Ukamoshel koyach ha-machshava, like for example, the power of thought, ha-mispashet b'muhus ha-nefesh, that extends from the mahus, the very personality of the nefesh. And we learned that earlier. Machshava is not, even though it's a levush, it's a garment, and it has oisius. At some point, it'll have relatively tangible letters, but it's rooted within the nefesh. The power of thought is not coming from somewhere else. It's not like someone goes and buys a suit in the store, which is not coming from your nefesh. It's an outer garment. Machshava is a koyach of the nefesh, ultimately. We say koyach, I'm saying it in broad terms because there are only 10 faculties and 3 levushim. Relative to let's say, the koyach haseichel, machshava is a levush, but it's still a power and ability that comes from the nefesh, to the point that even the letters of machshava, like you said earlier, nefesh malaya eisius, when you say letters, not actual letters, the power of expression. So the neshama, the nefesh that God implanted within us, also comes with the power of expression, and one of those powers is machshava. This we learned earlier. So, for example, in this machshava, yesh bezeh gimel madregas. So he's using machshava as an example for the oiris and kelim, which is interesting because oiris and kelim are more like koiches. The oiris is like the power of vision, the keli is like the eye. But yet, it doesn't matter because it's still ultimately all powers of the soul. So he says there are 3 levels. Ha'alef. Reishis hispashtusei min hamoker. Literally means the beginning of its extension, of its expression from its source. So it's a very abstract term. It needs explanation, but let me read it first and then I'll explain. Right when it's leaving, so to speak, as the mouth of the well, it's near its source, even though it's already reishis is pashtus, it's beginning to emerge from the moker, it's still ktsaz be'erech. It's still relatively close to the muhus, meaning the muhus of the nefesh, because it's not yet manifest itself, like we've been discussing, in a tangible or in a defined fashion. It's just the beginning of its journey, so to speak. V'loy zois shehu be'erech be'etzem muhusei, but you can't say that it's be'erech to the etzem muhus of the nefesh. Loimer, to say shehu muhusa etzem, you can't call it muhusa etzem either. It's just closer in its personality. It's more similar to the muhusa etzem, but it's not the muhusa etzem. Shari b'chinas ha'ora v'ziv levad, because we've already established that it's ha'ora and v'ziv. It's not the etzem. So let's, for example, say the light of the sun, right when it begins to emerge from the sun. We'll say even as it is in the sun, but it's sunlight. Obviously, it's going to be a lot closer and a lot more similar to the sun than, let's say, sunlight that is here millions of miles away. Even though it still retains its power of light and warmth. That's the light that we receive on Earth. But you can't compare it because when it's closer to the sun, it's so much more under the effect of the sun. Or think of a student who's he's just beginning to receive something from his teacher. The idea that's coming from the teacher is still on the teacher level. It's emerged, and it's not the teacher's mind. It's a reflection, but it's a reflection that's very similar to its source. Meaning it has its properties, it's much more reflective of its source than when the light reaches lower levels, as we'll soon discuss the 2 other levels. So on one hand, now this is very similar to what we've learned before, but clearly the Rebbe Rashab is going with the approach of the Alter Rebbe, and this is the Alter Rebbe. When you look at my more of the Alter Rebbe, he says something, he explains it a little bit, then he can go back to it and explain it again. So you could ask yourself, 1 second, why didn't he say this earlier? Right, when he began about Ur, this would have been very fitting, very well there. But that's how the Alter Rebbe structured it. He began with Ur, then he went to Machshava, then he went back to the Ur with the Muhus Acher, and now he's going to these 3 levels. And he says, like, okay, so you can't say it's be'erech, it's commensurate in its core muhus, because it's only to say it's like muhusa etzem. That it's not. That not. Because it's only ha'ara v'ziv levad. Ela kavana, the intention here He's saying b'bchinas hiskalus levad. Okay, here too a new word, hiskalus levad. That he means that it's when he says the words that it is huksaz be'erech hamahus. He means in the context of it being encompassed in the source. So it's very much under its influence. Like I gave the example with the teacher, as the idea that's beginning to emerge from the teacher, when it's still just at its early stages of emergence, it's still under the influence, if you wish, or encompassed by basically, I don't want to use the word shadow, but it's essentially under the aura of the source. Even though it's not the source, it's under its effect, hiskalus levad. I have to look inside. I think the Rebbe Rashab is explaining what the Alter Rebbe means by be'erech hamahus. So that's what he means, be'erech hamahus, and it's not mahus mamish. Be'erech hamahus. So it means it's commensurate to it, meaning it's under that effect and under that influence. So basically, in simple English, it means that even though it's already an expression of the divine, but it's very much a reflective of the divine in its highest levels. Whereas lower levels of Oir will be much more under the effect of the Kalim. For example, the colors that the Oiris assume when they enter into Kalim, that's under the effect of the color. Here, you won't say that the first level of Oir is colored. He said that on the third level of Oir. I'm just using that as an example here. Here, it's still under the effect of the Mokar. And we talked many times about the interface. In the interface itself, you have a level that's closer to the source. You have a level that's closer to the recipient. And then you have a level in between that connects them both. That's what a real interface is. That's how it works best, when it has all those elements, and that way it can be fully integrated. So that's what he means when he says be'erech hamahus. Leimesh ene b'chinas mahus nivdal. That it's not a mahus nivdal. You can't call it a separate identity or a separate entity, like he used those words earlier. So it's clearly he's connecting it to what we learned in the previous page. So you can't call it a mahus nivdal because it's not yet really even a manifestation of revelation. It's just the reishis hispashtuse. It's just the beginning of something emerging. The ein b'chinas mitzias oir adayin. At this level, you can't call it a mitzias oir. Kireishis hamshacha, because when you say the beginning of a hamshacha, the beginning of a transmission, hushanimsha b'chinas helam adayin. That's a very important point, because the beginning of the emergence of any gilui is still in a concealed state. It doesn't just suddenly start bursting into gilui. Those are stages. The ein b'chinas mitzias oir adayin. Kireish hamshacha hushanimsha b'chinas helam adayin. Ulechein ein nikra be'emes hamshacha mamish adayin. So you can't really call it a hamshacha, mamish. You can't actually call it a transmission, because it's just beginning to emerge. The full transmission would be when the light is in full force being transmitted to the next levels. The hamshacha is shemer begilui, because when you say transmission, it means it's radiating in a revealed way. V'kan hu rak shenimshach tzas. And here, it's only transmitted slightly, very, 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 very limited, very minimally. It's in order to prepare the ground that afterwards will be the hamshacha and gilui. So let's say, for example, when the dawn breaks. You ever see the dawn break? So the sun is not shining at full glory. You're just beginning to see. Just like literally when the dawn breaks, you just see little glimmers of light begins to emerge on the horizon. If it continues, it begins to get stronger and stronger. Midday, you have the full light of the sun. But it is Reishis HaMshacha. It's already, you call it the dawn. It's Aleis HaShachar. It's no longer night. Just as an example. I'm not suggesting that example is a perfect example here. But as far as Hamshacha goes, the etzem, just go back to the etzem. The etzem itself is no gili altogether. It's just an etzem. Then there's the first level, he's calling it the reishis haspashtuse, or reishis hamshachase. So it's just a little. And then comes the level that he's going to talk about Hamshacha v'gili. Achar kach b'chinas hamshacha. Aval b'hamshacha zu hu behelam adayim. This is clearly the Rebbe Rashab explaining, because the length here, the Alter Rebbe doesn't usually explain anything so many lines. So therefore he's saying, but this hamshacha is still behelam adayim. It's still in a concealed state. Now, I'm going to say concealed, it doesn't mean totally concealed, obviously, because it is the beginning of spastus and amshacha. Okay. Umela, and for that very reason, you cannot say that it's a mitzias yet, to say that it's a mahus achar, because it's still basically just a flow from the source. It's not the source because it's a reflection, but it's just the initial spurt, if you wish, the initial reflection before it begins to expand and extend. Adrabah, on the contrary, it's continuing. This is still all the first level. Hu kolol u'misachid b'mekeiday adayim. On the contrary, not only is it not an identity of its own, it's still encompassed and united in the source. So, yes, he did say it's the beginning of something, but its main identity at this point is still an extension. It's still under the effect of the source. Okay. Let me stop. If there are any questions up to this point? Remember, he still only talked about level 1. Then I see now it's Sarach. Okay. Any questions?
I have a question, and I'm not going to get the language right, but we talked during base. We talked about how he's called this integration between spheros, particularly as one sphera emanates to the next below it. So, like, take Chachma and Bina. We talked about Haben b'Chacham and Chacham b'Haben. I think those were the words.
Okay.
Is this related? What we just read here?
No.
Okay.
Iskalus is used in many different ways in Chassidus. Here he's talking about Iskalus ha'oir b'hamoir. What you're talking about is Iskalus ha'koiches or Iskalus ha'sfiras.
Mm-hmm.
Very different.
Okay.
I mean, the word is the same. It means
Yes.
one thing is encompassed in another.
Right.
But that's about it. It's only a translation of the word. This is Iskalus here, is Iskalus ha'oir in the moir.
I understand.
It's a critical concept in Chassidus. I explained the reasoning for it, because remember, all this is about interface. And if you want to have an experience of God in his purest form, you want to have a taste of him on his terms. I always use the word on his terms, on our terms. A real relationship is really 3 steps. It's the terms of the mashpia, the terms of the makabel, and then something that joins them together. That's why there's always 3 whenever it comes to real integration. So he's talking here about that level of Ur. Now, before he gets to level 2, he adds now a tzarech.
Thank you, by the way.
But tzarech, says the Rebbe Rashab, I'm continuing. He's exactly addressing what I asked before. He says tzarech, we need iyun, we need to delve into this, meaning tzarech is usually a question, or it needs explanation. Im zeu hamadrega aleph shenisbar le'il. He's asking basically, is this the first level that we discussed earlier in the parentheses on page 53? The question I asked when we began. I didn't realize the Rebbe Rashab asks it himself. Now, the reason, before I read on, the reason that it's seemingly, why not? Why not just say it's the first level? The first level said clearly, if you look back, he said that the Eidos, there are 3 levels, and the first one's the way Klulim, the way they're encompassed in the Maitzil, in the emanator. I'm reading from the previous page. But I think the reason that it's a tzarachian, and we'll see in a minute what the Rebbe Rashab says about it, is because, by the way, he says here, Reishis is Pashtusan. There, it just says klulim b'matzila. So you could talk about the light within the sun, but it hasn't yet even expressed itself, even like the rays of the dawn, in the example I gave. Whereas here he does use the word reishis hispashtuse, which means it's the beginning of some hispashtus. So it's a tzarachin. Does reishis hispashtus mean that it's still really encompassed in the source? And you're just using the reishis hispashtus as a expression to explain that it's beginning to prepare itself to extend? Or is it actually an extension, even like a glimmer? I think that's why it's not so black and white, to just say that the first level that we spoke about before is the same first level. But here's what the Rebbe Rashab says now about this. So, Kishama Kavana, what's the tzarechim? Because there, on the previous page, when we talked about the first level, he said, there the Kavana, the intention was, Al Eses Sfiris HaKlulim B'Keser. Even though, frankly, he didn't say that explicitly, but he did say Antu Chad V'Lei B'Chushbon, and I think the Mokemacher probably means that. That there he was talking about the spheres as they're encompassed in Keser. V'kan Lefi Anira, and here, apparently, Lefi Anira means the Rebbe Rashab is saying, it seems, Hakavon ala Keser Atzmei. Not the spheres as they're encompassed in Keser, but here it seems like he's talking about Keser itself. So there's the way Keser is included in its source, not the way the spheres are included in Keser. So it's actually different the way I just explained it, Sarachian. I don't think it's a contradiction. I think they both are factors. The bottom line is, the Rebbe Rashab is not concluding here, is not coming to anything conclusive and definitive. Is this first level the same first level we talked about before or not? He's just pointing out that we need to look into it. So it's something we could discuss. I'm not going to discuss it right now because we're covering what the Rebbe Rashab is saying. And clearly the Rebbe Rashab wanted to explain it, he would have. But he's saying that Tzarechien, which means he's talking about the mimer of the Alter Rebbe, because the Rebbe Rashab would never say it Tzarechien on himself. He clearly is talking about a mimer that was said, and he's trying to understand what the pshat in that mimer is. So bottom line is that I want to look back at the mimer of the Alter Rebbe myself to see the exact language there. But clearly, the Rebbe, I could trust the Rebbe Rashab when he says that Tzarechim means it's not definitive. Okay, good. Continuing on, Ukashem ispashit yeser. Now we're talking about. Now he's starting to enter the level number 2. When the oir is mispashit yeser, it extends further. V'naseh b'chinas machshava. Remember, the Moshe is using his machshava. There was machshava as it was reishis is pashtuse min hamoker. Okay, now he's saying when it now extends further and it's actually becoming an active thought, the hainu shecheshe ve'ze inyan. It's no longer just the beginnings and the early stages of machshava coming from the source. Now he's beginning to think about an actual topic, eze inyan. It's an actual thought. Harihu b'chinas gili u'b'chinas mitzias. Now you can call it a revelation and something of substance, has an identity. Till now he kept saying it's not a gili and not a mitzias. It's a helam. It's still encompassed in the source, even though it's the beginnings of the concept of a reflection. But it's not really fully manifest. Ad shenefla lav lemer oz, to the extent, this second level, to the point that you can now apply shu b'chinas eir v'ziv. You can now call it a light and a reflection, or b'chinas levush bilvad, and it's only a garment. No, until now you couldn't even call it that. It was not the etzem, but you couldn't call it yet a separate entity either, or not a separate. Couldn't call it an entity. I don't not use the word separate, an entity. V'zeu amadrega habeis, and this is the second level of in this process. And what's the third level? Okay. And as the thought now gets defined by a distinction of letters. In other words, it's becoming defined with parameters, not just an idea, but like he said before, it's actually taking on the shape of letters. Now you sense letters. Letters means you sense parameters, you sense definitions. They are the containers. They're the containers of the Eir that define and limit the Eir. And that's the third level. Now, even though earlier he said about Eishis and Machshava that it's Eiris and not Kalim in this context, but remember he explained that it's all relative. It's Kalim and Eiris, depending whether you're talking about compared to a higher level or compared to a lower level. So it's not a contradiction what he's saying now. He's calling them Kalim because Eishis, end of the day, are Kalim. The only thing is the Alter Rebbe uses the example for Eir, but remember, it's the Eir as it manifests in the Kalim, ultimately. And Machshava, that's what happens. The Eir of Machshava, which is Levush HaMeyuchad, like a Mechuber, a Levush that's connected to the Eir, to the idea that it conveys, and even to the very mocker of the soul, like we learned, it then manifests in letters. It does manifest in Kalim. However, it still retains its higher state, and that's why you can call it both names, as we discussed earlier. But bottom line is, there are three levels of Machshava. There is, just to sum it up, there's Maspash Mahusa Nefesh. The first is when it begins to extend, but it's still very much part of the source, though it's already not the very matter, or not the substance of the source, not what he called it, it's Erech HaMahus, even though it's not Etzem HaMahus. Then there's the second level, then it's not yet a Gilui, it's still concealed mostly. Then it becomes a Gilui and a Metzias, and then it becomes defined by the containers, by the letters. Those are the three levels. V'nimtza, let's just conclude. In the Nimtza, what we derive, what do we take away from this? Shebchinas Eiris v'kelim inyanam hu hamachshava atzma. Because he all started with Eiris and Kelim. He gave the example of Machshava for the energies and containers. Their inyan is hu hamachshava atzma mashachesha v'sa inyan. That the level of Eiris and Kelim is the machshava, what he's already thinking of the idea, v'hagbolas hamachshava. Let me just read this again, just to understand it clearly. 1 second. Oh, okay. Let me explain what he's going to say now. So now that we've established these three levels, he's now going to go back to understand them in the context of Eiris and Kelim. Because based on what we just said, the third level, there's Kelim, Eiris and Kelim. And that's the letters that give it definition and so on. The level before Kelim is the Eir without a Keli, but it's already an Eir, a Gili. You have an idea. You're thinking about something. It's just not yet fully defined yet. And then you have the first level where you can't even call it an idea yet. You can't call it an entity. It's the beginning, it's the Reishis HaSpashtus, Reishis HaMshacha. So now he's going to explain that in this context. He says like this. Nimtza, I'm reading it again. Nimtza, Shebchinas Eiris v'kelim inyanim hu hamachshava atzma. That the Eiris v'kelim is the very thought itself. That's level 2. Mashachesha v'seinin. He's thinking about an idea. V'hagbolas hamachshava. And the third level is the hagbolas hamachshava, the parameters of this thought. So there's the thought and the parameters of the thought. 2 levels. Level 2 and 3. Aval koyach hamachshava. But the power of thought, keshenimshach min hamoker, as it extends and transmits from the source, bereishis hamshachase, in its initial beginning of its flow, eina b'bchinas mahus la'atzmei adayin. You can't call it yet as a mahus la'atzmei, an entity on its own. Umamela muven she'eina b'chinas nivdal v'nifred klal. and Mamela it's understood. You can't call it separate and divided from. Nivdal, separate from, and nifred. There's two words for separate. Nivdal means apart from, and nifred means separate from at all. Elatomid hu nichla ba'mokar. But it's constantly encompassed in its source, even though it's already a stage, but it's still all under the effect of its source. Afa pisho nimshach tzas mimenu. Even though it did extend somewhat from there, ukanal, as was explained before. Okay, so those are the three levels. And now he's going to go back and explain it in the spheres above. Well, let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything before we continue.
I wonder if this system or process is, I should say, what is related to the idea of how God begins the creation process. I should really say this is this related to that, because that's obviously where it starts. We talked about at the very highest levels of godliness that within Atzmus, how does the creation process start? And it starts within God's own mind, so to speak. And that even just the idea of something other. Of course, it's when we did it there, it was like, I don't know, 7 or 8 or 9 steps. It was very complicated. But is this, in a sense, something like that, where ultimately God thinks of something that's other, and by doing so, he essentially begins creating other? Do you remember that whole sugya in Ayin Beis?
Of course. Yes, it's an Ayin Beis and many places in Chassidus. Generally speaking, yeah, it's a very fundamental piece. Generally speaking, when it comes to these things, we try to stay away from making too strong comparisons, because unless the Rebbe himself brings that into the picture, this could very likely be more. He's talking in general through the whole Ishtalshalos that there's these three levels. He's not necessarily referring to as it is in its earliest genesis, what you're describing. In other words, this is not necessarily before the Tzimtzum even. This is most likely after the Tzimtzum, actually.
No, so, I get it. I'm just saying, is that that highest level is an archetype?
Listen, you could always make parallels whenever you're talking about a process of something coming from a very amorphous, or you can call it non-existential state, into an existential state. You can always show parallels, like the simple parallel of the conception of a one cell that will then split into 75 trillion cells of a child. So a seed, everything in existence will go through stages where it begins as a one singularity or something that's not defined, and then will suddenly begin to manifest definition. So we learned at length this concept, yes, that before it arose in God's desire, it wasn't even conscious or aware. Then it arises in his desire. Then he envisions the 10 spheres, Shir Asmei B'Koyach. So the concept, general concept, that everything moves from a more an undefined state to a defined state, absolutely. But to be able to make exact parallels between specific Maimorim, that we generally stay away from, unless the Rebbe himself does that parallel, because you'll find it through all the Ishtalshalos. You can go to the world of Asiya, as I just said, the world of planting a seed in the ground, and observe that seed through its stages of gestation, and you see it grow into a big apple tree, or a big any tree, and you'll also have these stages. So you find this everywhere, including what you're referring to as it is in its the earliest stages of how we understand, where just begins to emerge from Atzmos and Akol Batzmos and so on, which we will learn later in Samach Vav more in detail. Here I see clearly that he's thinking that it's more Keser. He actually called it Keser in the parentheses here. So clearly he's talking about this more in Ishtalshalos. Well, yes. I'll say Ishtalshalos, more in the post-Tzimtzum reality.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Excellent.
So again, there are many parallels, and as a matter of fact, when Chassidim who taught Chassidus well, they often make these parallels. But I wouldn't put it in the mimer per se right now, because right now this is what I would stick to. This would go talk in the context. This would go into the Mokra Machshava. There you could talk about all these things. I'm talking more the Oisis Machshava. What topic is he actually addressing here? It's very important to stick to, be in our lane. And then once you master this, as well as one can master it, we then can start applying it and saying, oh, you know what, this parallels this idea, that idea. That's a big part of absorbing and then processing. That's what I'm doing right now as well.
Understood. Thank you very much.
No, it's fine. It's a good question, especially when you learn Chassidus, different things, you start seeing similarities and parallels. So by all means, it's very good, and I'm glad you asked. I'm glad that I'm able to qualify, because it's an important point. I mean, I just remember when I came to an understanding myself of this. First I would always compare everything, and then I realized before you make comparisons, first understand each one in its own world, and then say, oh, there's a similarity between this and that. You see?
Yes, understood. I always appreciate when you not only teach the content, but the pedagogical method and the way to learn Chassidus. So I'm very appreciative of that.
Good. I'm glad. That's good. And there is a real method. There's no question about it. You see it even here. You see how the Rebbe Rashab is dissecting a mimer of the Alter Rebbe, and you see how sensitively he does it. He doesn't just jump to conclusions. Sarachian, we need to know this level, does it fit with this level? Even here, the first thing you would think is these three levels are these three levels. It's literally sounds almost the same. And nevertheless, it's not so clear. I'm just pointing out how
yes,
when you start looking at it, because you really want to know what level you're talking about. That's not always very clear. The Alter Rebbe's Maimer, that's what's not clear. Is he talking about Kesser? Is he talking about the spheres? Is he talking about Eris and Kalim in general? I actually, when I'm reading it, my inclination was that he's talking about Er Lefnei Tzimtzum, because I'm so accustomed to Er Hakol Batzmuse is the highest level. Then there's Etzema Er. Then there's Ispashtus Er La'atzmei, and then Ispashtus Er L'Zulosei. Those are three levels we talked about before the Tzimtzum. But now I see, but I didn't even say that because I immediately picked up that he's not talking about that, even though, again, there's very close parallels to it. Okay, good. So let me see here. Yeah, I think we'll probably stop here. Yeah, he's going to explain what that is, ulamaila. So we'll stop by the word ulamaila, like 2/3 down the page, 54. I'm glad we learned. This is a good what shall we say? A good injection for Purim morning, at least in this part of the world. I know, yeah. Okay, we'll stop here. Are there any other questions? Okay. Let me stop here. Stop the recording. And I'll just say one thing before I stop the recording. Since it's Purim, I've been thinking about it. Maybe I'll record a little piece, a little greeting. There's the mitzvah. It says, "Chayiv inish lebesuma b'puria." A person is obligated on Purim to drink to the point Ada Layada. We cannot distinguish between Ar Haman and Baruch Mordechai. That cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. So of course it's a very strange statement. What does that mean? First of all, what kind of drinking to oblivion to the point you can't tell? And why would that be a virtue, not to distinguish between good and evil? The curse of Haman is very different than the blessing of Mordechai. So one of the explanations actually in the Maimer that the Rebbe speaks about, when I mentioned yesterday, when Stalin died on Purim 1953, so he doesn't say this explicitly, but he talks about the Pur, why Purim is called Purim, because Pur is the girdle. What connection does it have? Yes, the lottery was part of the story because Haman threw lots, and the lots fell out in the month of Adar. But that's like seems so incidental to the whole story. The story is the liberation, the freedom, the abolishment of the decree, and it became a tremendous holiday because instead of total genocide, God forbid, it was a total celebration. So the explanation is because Geirel is a higher level of Elikus than Tam V'das. When you throw lots, it means you can't figure it out on logic. You don't need to throw lots. You figure out, like Haman could have sat down and said, what's the best month in the year, God forbid, to make this plot and conspiracy against the Jews. By throwing lots, he's like looking at and depending on something that's, we'll call it superconscious. And the Rebbe explains in that Maimer at length why. Because Haman knew in the conscious world he's not going to be able to necessarily prevail over the Jews. But he thought maybe on a superconscious level, where things are more like a makif, that's an equalizer, maybe he can do it there. His mistake was that on that level too, even on that superconscious level, he also was unable to achieve what he wanted to achieve. But in Avodas Hashem, basically, there's two types of Avodah. Yada, and Avodah, which is Tam V'das. Using your rational mind, you learn Torah, you do mitzvahs, you daven. But then there's Mesiras Nefesh, where there's a commitment beyond the rational. Because, Mesiras Nefesh, you could say, why should I sacrifice myself for my beliefs? Why should I put my life in danger? Or Mesiras Nefesh, even if it's not life in danger, at least total commitment. Everyone has a back door. Everyone has an exit strategy. Total commitment. Nasa v'nishma, Kabbalah. Because the fact is, the true connection with things you really believe in are not just based on pure rational, which means when there's a reason you'll do it, when there's no reason you won't. It's total commitment. In relationships, for example, you're really committed to your spouse, to your family, to your children. So just because something didn't work out your way, you don't say, I'm out of here because it wasn't convenient. In a business deal or a business contract, you could say, the contract was broken. You know what? I'm not bound forever with my partners. They broke the contract, or there's reasons to split apart, we'll split apart. That's what Moshe argued with Hashem for Yom Kippur. Yom Kippurim is like Purim. Now, what did he say to Hashem? Yes, they built a golden calf, terrible, complete infidelity, complete betrayal. But I know that your connection with the people, with the Jews, and the Jews' connection with you is on a fundamental atzmizdika level. And that's what I'm looking to access. I want to rebuild it based on that. If it was purely based on commitment, yeah, you made a commitment, you broke the commitment, deal is off. But Moshe knew deeper than that. And that's why it's like the Etzem HaNeshama. Itzuma Shayem Mechaper. And Purim is compared to Yom Kippur in that sense. They both have that element of Geirel. Yom Kippur is also a Geirel. You also throw lots to decide which soyer will go, Lazazel will be like an offering of kapara, and which soyer will be brought an offering in the Beis Hamikdash. So there's the girdle in both Purim and Yom Kippur, because you're reaching a level that's super conscious. So the mitzvah of Adal Yada is not about drinking till you lose consciousness in a negative way. That Judaism would never advocate something like that. It means to reach a level of super consciousness where there you can transform darkness to light. In a world of consciousness, light and dark are two tracks. Haman is Haman, Mordechai is Mordechai. But you can't transform it. So they remain two separate entities. The Mishnah, the halacha is saying that on Purim you can reach a level where you can transform darkness to light, because you're reaching a level that's higher than Baruch and Baruch Mordechai and Haman. So may Hashem bless us all that we can reach that level within our souls today on Purim. We're facing an Haman right now in Iran and all its proxies and cohorts, just like Haman had his cohorts. And we should experience the superconscious level of Nepachu, that it should all be transformed, not just eliminated, transformed. That on the same gallows that Haman built to hang Mordechai, he was hung. and total transformation into, as I said earlier, like Yehudim, Eis Erev V'Simcha V'Sasan V'Yakar. Like we say in Havdalah, Kain Tia Lanu.
Oh man,
Okay.
square, beautiful, beautiful,
A little Purim Torah.
wonderful, wonderful. I have a news update that's similar, that kind of is a little bit of a touch on that, Balabatisha, but I don't know if I should say it on the recording or not.
Go ahead, why not?
It's a Purim pleasure. Just as this class began, Israel destroyed the building where they were electing the new leader. They had, I don't know, dozens and dozens of clerics there, and they were on the third vote. And they just destroyed the building and the people that were picking the new leader. Dozens and dozens of clerics. Their whole process of selecting a new leader is gone. So you're talking about transformation, where Mama's, please God, transforming Iran from a clerical dictatorship into, please, a democracy where the people get to have their freedom and choose their form of government.
Did anyone have problems, by the way? I see in the group. Did anyone have problems with the Zoom today?
Not at all.
No. One
Okay.
fellow, 5-0 Chandler, lost connection, but I think it was on his end.
Yeah, because I see everybody's here. So okay. Yeah, shekayach for that news. May go Michael Chayil.
Oh man. Yeah, it's a party. I mean, it's not to minimize losses. There are losses.
No,
in
and
Israel.
it's still danger. And
Yeah.
the question is, what do you do? I mean, you're dealing with, I don't know what to say. I don't think these are people that are going to surrender. That's the thing.
No, but they're Israel, specifically Israel, maybe a little bit the United States, creating the conditions where the Iranian people can take over and perhaps even persuade the remaining people holding guns, like the regular army is different than the IRGC and the police, regular civilian police in the street, where they say, you know what, this is not looking good for us. We need to get on board, get with the program. So they're creating the conditions where the people can literally retake control of their country. That's how I see it.
Did they kill them all? Did they kill them?
It's hot news. I don't know, but they got a lot of the clerics. They disrupted their entire process of selecting a new leader, and probably whoever was in line was in the room too. That was a huge haul. It's a big deal. It's a big deal.
No, it's the equivalent of attacking, let's say, the Congress in Washington.
Exactly. They did that too, by the way. They destroyed their parliament yesterday. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Okay.
We call it, if I'm from the Midwest, we call it piling.
But Nefele Vecha Al Tishmach, it says, even when your enemies fall, don't celebrate. But you have to cut the serpent off at the head. That's the bottom line.
100%. 100%.
Okay, so let me stop the recording here.
Yeah.